Yeah.
How's this go?
So the point, the purpose, the goal is to basically find out more about you guys. Maybe not find out more. Well, yeah, find out more about you guys of what we either already did know between the two of us and Tiffany and have forgotten, or we never knew, or we have a warped perception of it because we were little kids or something like that.
Yeah.
And I don't care if we talk on one topic for the whole hour, or I got a bunch of questions here. If we don't ever get to any of them, awesome. If we just end up, having a conversation about whatever. But let's start with, I don't know if I call it boring stuff, but not you guys. Maybe we'll start with you. We'll let you have some time to think about it. Start with your grandparents, and depending on how much you know, you can go super in depth. But just the simple stuff about what you remember about your grandparents. Like, basically, where did your grandparents, what were their simple things? Maiden names. Or not maiden names, but, full names. Where were they born? How they get here? How they get to California? If they did get to California, where'd they end up at? Stuff like that. Stuff I couldn't probably tell you about my grandparents right now.
Okay. Do you even know my grandparents' names?
Couldn't even know.
Okay. Well, Grandma Jean's parents were John Patrick Sullivan, and I don't know Grandma's middle name. Her name was Della
John
Ryan.
Patrick Sullivan?
Yeah.
So is that how I got Patrick?
Well, yeah, Patrick. Well, we got it because we liked it. But, yeah, it was a family name. And her name was Della Ryan. Grandma lived in Delta, Colorado, and Grandpa lived in Olathe. They were 11 miles apart. But Olathe, Colorado did not have a Catholic church. The Catholic church was in Delta. So that's how he met Grandma. And then he was a telegrapher on the railroad, and he got transferred out here to California. And obviously Grandma came with them, and that's why their kids were born here.
That's the
soul.
machine we have in the bedroom. The
telegrapher sends the
Yeah,
Morse code.
the Morse code.
We have that.
I have his telegraphy machine. They have their own touch, and they kind of like to.
And that was Sullivan's.
That was the Sullivans. And so then my Uncle Jack was born in San Francisco because that's where he was. Then they moved down to L.A., but Grandma's grandfather got sick. They went back for the funeral, and Grandma ended up being born in Olathe because my grandma came early.
Olathe? What is that?
That's Colorado. Okay. So
Okay.
Grandma Jean lived here while she was pregnant, but because they took the train back and Grandma had her back there, she was there for a couple of weeks. And then Grandpa Bob's parents were both born in Texas. And again, my grandfather, Robert Wallace Sr., got transferred to California with the railroad. And he was they called him paymasters then. He did the payroll.
For the railroad. So they both worked for the railroad.
Yeah, but Grandpa Sullivan then went to work for Mobil Oil. So after business college, he went to work for the railroad, but he was only there, I think, about 10 years, and then he went to work for Mobil Oil in Torrance. And that's why they lived in Gardena.
I'm impressed that you know that much.
And
That's
then,
why I had her go. I should have had you go first.
And Grandpa Bob's.
You want to call Valerie?
Hard act to follow. Yeah.
No.
Can I call a friend?
Yeah.
Grandpa Bob's mother was Ann Varley, and that's where I got the name Ann because of her name was Ann.
Did you know that? Did you know Ann came from?
No idea. Wait, so Ann came from?
Grandpa Bob's mother was named Ann.
Grandpa Bob's mother.
Our great grandma. So both of them started out. Both of your grandparents
Started out with the railroads.
And started out with the railroads in Colorado.
No, Texas. My other grandpa's parents were born in Texas. But they both, you know what, they must have worked for the railroads all during the Depression, because I remember Grandma Jean saying, well, Grandpa and I were both lucky. Our fathers both had jobs because they worked for the railroads during the Depression, they never got laid off.
Mm.
Where they hardly knew anybody whose parents worked the entire time through the Depression. So it must have been probably during the war that they. Well, my Grandpa Bob's father retired from the railroad. He always worked for the railroad, but at some point, Grandpa Sullivan left him.
So I'm losing track here. So did Grandpa Bob's dad come out here?
They came out here with the railroad.
He-
Sometime before Grandpa Bob was born, because he was born in 1918, and he was born in L.A.
So let's follow that. So okay, and jump in whenever you
I'm
want.
trying to catch up with the timeline.
No, I'm totally. Yeah.
Teen-
So
I'm
they
gonna have to
were-
rewatch. This is why I'm recording. So I don't have to read.
They were all born in the 1890s.
Okay. And then
All of your grandparents.
I think my grandfather was. I think Grandpa Bob's dad was born in 1988 or 1888, and then the others were born in like 90, 94, 96.
1888 and we're 2018.
Yeah.
For the record, we're 2018. For this time capsule we're doing.
And because they worked for the railroads, they did not serve in World War I because they were considered. They had to
Essential personnel.
essential
or something.
personnel.
How about that? That was good. Actually, could be one of my questions. If you knew any of their military service.
They didn't. The only military service was Jack.
Grandpa
Well-
Bob's brother.
Yeah, and Grandma Jean's brother Jack, but he was like a sergeant that was in charge of ordering supplies. So he spent his time in San Francisco.
Jack did.
Jack, no, Grandma Jean's brother, Uncle Jack, Grandpa Bob's brother. He was the one that got the Purple Heart in Luxembourg. He actually fought.
See, I'm gonna have to listen to this all back again because it's.
Well, he was only 18. He got drafted at 18 because he was young. Jack had already been out working when the war broke out, I think, and so my other Uncle Jack.
Got drafted into World War I.
Two.
Okay.
Those are my uncles. My grandparents
Right.
would have fought in World War I,
Right.
but they didn't because they worked for the railroads.
Someone. Oh, they all. Oh, I thought. Jack was the only one that.
Jack was the only
served
one.
in combat.
Yeah, because he was 18. He didn't have any
Right.
experience. He went right
In
out of
World
high
War II.
school. Yeah,
But both your grandparents.
worked for the
Grandfathers.
railroads, so they did not serve.
Okay. You gotta stop shaking. Mess up the audio.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I gotta process that. I'm really impressed that you knew all that and you knew the timelines, the dates and stuff like that.
Yeah, pretty much could tell you.
So they ended up out here. Both your grandparents ended up out here because of the railroads.
Mm-hmm.
And then Grandpa Bob was born. Do you know where he is?
He was
where
born in the first hospital established in Los Angeles, which is no longer there, and I don't know the name of it.
In 1918.
1918. So that was after the First War was just ending.
And Grandma was younger, older.
Grandma Jean was not born until 1921. And so they lived in L.A., but because they got on the train for her grandfather's funeral, she was born in Colorado.
Okay.
So then they stayed there for about 2 weeks. But her birthplace is actually Olathe, Colorado, even though
She lived out here.
her parents lived out here.
All right, before we run down that rabbit hole, you want to spend your 2 seconds telling us what you know about your grandparents?
I could probably fill in.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make it. My grandfather on my mom's side, I did meet him, and I think I saw him twice in my life. They lived in Maryland, Annapolis. That's where my mom grew up. That's where my dad met my mom. He was in the Navy, stationed in Annapolis.
Your
My
grandfather.
dad. My dad.
Stay with your grandparents for a while.
Grandfather.
Well, that's
Did we
all
tap
I know
out?
about him.
See?
I saw him twice, and both times they never came out to California ever. So
What was his name?
Jack, I think, or John. Do you know? I don't know.
I thought it was
Your grandpa.
My dad's father.
Grandpa John.
Yeah.
I think.
okay. He wasn't from Annapolis, though.
No.
Very confusing.
No.
What was your mother's father's name from Annapolis?
John, I think.
We'll just go with John because both
I
Johns.
saw him twice, and The last time I saw him, I was like 8 years old.
Because they were in Maryland and you guys were
in
here.
Maryland, and we only
Yeah.
visited twice before he passed.
Yeah. Pan American Airlines only had so many flights, probably at that time. TWA and Pan
Back
American.
then, it was kind of a big deal to
I
take
know.
an airplane and go.
You had
there.
so many suits to fly because you had to wear a suit and fly in Pan Am. I feel like.
It was kind of a big deal. You walked across
Yeah.
the tarmac and climbed up in the airplane and all that stuff. And my grandma, well, same thing. I only saw her twice, even though she lived a lot longer than him. She never came out here either. And my mom had 2 brothers and a sister. And the one sister moved out here. God, I forgot her name. It was a funny name.
Snooky.
Snooky, yeah.
Loretta.
Oh yes, I remember Snooki.
You remember Snooky?
She moved out here and married a guy that was kind of the black sheep of the family. Nobody really cared for him. And we didn't see them too much. Sort of a bad influence on everybody.
He was kind of a raging alcoholic, wasn't
Yeah, Snooki was a sweetheart. I mean, she was great. She was like, she and my mom were 2 peas in a pod. Same personality, same everything.
How much older is Snooki than your mom?
he? They were a year apart, I think.
Is that it? I don't know. You're,
They got married on the same day. Or the same month. Same month
In the same year?
in the same year.
We almost did that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
um,
What was your
Yeah,
grandmother's
his
name?
Are
brothers.
you recording on your phone?
yeah.
What's your mother's name? What was your grandmother's
My
name?
mother's name?
No, your grandmother's name. Was it Goldie?
Yes. Yeah. I remember Aunt Lala.
Yeah.
Had an aunt that lived on the Chesapeake Bay. That was a big deal when you're a little guy in grammar school to go to her house because she lived right on the bay. Had a house right on the water.
On Chesapeake
Yeah.
in Maryland.
Yeah. And when I was a kid, me and Valerie thought it was like a gigantic adventure. She lived in a real rural area, had this big old 2-story house, big trees, chickens and stuff in the backyard. And they used to,
Outside of Annapolis?
no,
Well, it must have been outside of Annapolis.
well, it was
I guess-
outside of
yeah, I
Annapolis.
guess
I'm trying to
that's-
think.
yeah.
I don't
I don't know
even
my way around
We
there
just
anyways.
used to say it was on the Chesapeake Bay. I
Yeah.
don't even remember what town it was in. But I just remember it was a real big deal, pretty high adventure to go to her place.
Probably felt like Huck Finn.
Well, it was like that because it was all wide open and the kids
Yeah.
just went wherever and nobody really cared. And they raised their chickens and ate their chickens and killed them in the backyard. And,
Went crabbing.
yeah, went crabbing. People out here don't know what crabbing is, but it's where you actually walk into Chesapeake Bay, shallow waters, pulling a rowboat behind you, and you've got poles with nets on them, kind of like a pole cleaner uses, but more heavy duty than that. And the crabs are kind of running around, and you scoop them up and throw them in the boat, and then you brought them back home, and my mom and the ladies cooked them, boiled them.
Sell the extras?
No, they ate
See
them. They ate them crab cakes. And the thing that was really weird for here, here, everything's locked up there. The rowboat, you just pulled it up onto the shore
Loved it.
and went, and it wasn't even your property. You just, it was total.
Like it was just a boat that was just sitting there.
No, it was their boat,
Oh.
but they just kept it there. I don't even know whose property it was. It wasn't their property.
Oh, I get you.
People probably even borrowed it. And
Probably. And even at my grandmother's house, she was like 3 blocks in Annapolis from one of the inlets on the Chesapeake Bay. They had docks, little docks where people had their own boats and stuff. And I met the kid across the street, and we just walked down there to the water and do what little kids do, run around and throw rocks and fish and run through the bushes and stuff. It was pretty fun stuff. And then I can't remember the 2 brothers, Earl and Clinton. I remember one time they didn't have a car. I don't think my grandmother or grandfather had a car. Either one of them had a car. And so we used to take the bus everywhere when we visited. So we were coming home from shopping one day, and there was this giant boat in the backyard. They lived on a corner lot. So one of the brothers took down part of the hedge and dragged the boat in the backyard, and he was going to rebuild it, restore it. Yeah, my grandmother was not real happy about that, but anyway, she got over it. So that was kind of a big deal. Old rickety two-story. Well, the house seemed gigantic,
Right.
but then going on Google and looking at the house, it's not, it's not any bigger than your house.
Yeah. So Grandma is born there.
I don't know where she was born.
She was born in Minneapolis, I'm pretty sure.
Minneapolis. I don't know.
What about
Neither one of them were super interested in Valerie or me or kids.
neither one of the grandparents? Neither side of the grandparents?
No. Well, on my mom's side, we were just kind of there for my mom to see her parents.
It was different back then with grandparents.
They really
they
had
were old.
no.
In their
I mean,
60s, they were
mean.
old.
Yeah, they weren't mean or anything.
Yeah.
But I don't remember them, either one of them, ever doing anything with us at all. Zero.
It's hard for me to even picture Grandma Lucy with parents. It's hard for me to picture her young.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Just seems like an old soul to begin with.
Yeah.
No matter
Well,
what.
she might have been.
Yeah, my only recollection is an old soul.
Yeah.
And
Just didn't see. I can't picture her like screwing around.
yeah,
You
she's
know?
really,
Just
I can't either, to tell you the truth.
just business.
Yeah. Well, but in a soft way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my grandmother and grandfather on my mom's side, neither one of them ever came to California, and neither of the brothers ever came to California. And the sister moved to California. They lived out in Bellflower. And when we were living in Gardena, so we would see them occasionally, but not too much.
Grandma's sister, your aunt.
Yeah.
Snooky.
Snooky. That was Snooky. Okay.
Yeah. He was not Pepperdine. What was that? Occidental College.
Mm.
He taught at Occidental College. But he had all kinds of drinking issues and abusive and all that. And then on my dad's side, he died. I can't ever remember actually seeing him. Did he die the first time we were going there?
He died just before you moved out here. You weren't even 6 months old.
Yeah. So I don't even remember him. Never have no recollection of him at all.
This is who again?
My dad's father.
Grandpa Joe's.
Yeah, your dad. So
Everything I
did
know.
you actually meet him? I mean, did he meet you as a baby?
I don't know.
No, I think your mom said you got off the plane in Denver and he had died.
Yeah.
So
And wasn't that like your mom's first time meeting him, or second
Yeah.
time? I mean,
I don't
Valerie told me some story like that. Like maybe Grandma either didn't meet him or only met him
think
once.
that was the first time she met him. Because they had a wedding in Annapolis before Grandpa got out of the service. And people didn't travel to weddings then.
And Dad kind of did stuff. My dad kind of did stuff when he wanted to do it, and
Yeah, I was gonna say what the wedding looked like 4 people.
I have no
Chaplain,
idea.
Like a Navy chaplain,
I think
I
they
can
probably
picture
went
that.
to a chapel or the local church.
and four
Maybe family.
4 people that were available.
Yeah. I mean,
In
they didn't have
local
real
area.
big weddings back then
Right.
anyway, unless you were socialites.
Well, it was,
Right.
I mean, cake and punch.
Yeah.
And my parents' wedding was a big deal. You know, they had 150 people, and then they went back to the house afterwards. But at the church, it was cake and punch afterwards.
so then I saw my grandmother several times in Denver. She lived in Denver. And then she moved out here. So my dad could kind of look after her. She had an apartment on Imperial, about 3 or 4 miles from where our house was. And she stayed in that house until she was in her apartment. In her apartment in her 90s, lived by herself, and then she passed in her 90s.
Or if someday I'll be able to draw a timeline with pictures that.
Valerie
I'm
has.
having a hard time following all of this.
Valerie has a lot more
confused.
detail. Valerie actually has a bunch of family tree stuff.
Oh, she might be. Yeah, so she might be included if there's volumes to this. She might get included.
I'm sure she knows
She can straighten
a
it
lot
out.
more and ask a lot more questions.
Yeah.
Well, plus she's got a lot more family history because she's actually made contact with some of the cousins who I saw like once in my life, and well, she's figured they'd be happy to see her. so she.
You're saying she takes more after Grandma Lucy than you take more after Grandma Joe.
So she made
Well, and
trips
some
with
of them have come out here.
Yeah, and stayed with her. And so anyway, she has a whole bunch more family history, and she did the family tree stuff for a while.
So she was talking about one of your grandpas started off in somewhere in the Midwest and had some sort of store,
Oh my
hardware
God!
store or something like that.
Fish store,
Fish
Denver.
store.
fish market,
Fish and poultry.
And where was that at?
Kansas, I think it was.
No.
Kansas.
Oh,
Denver.
Denver.
No. Denver was the second one.
Well, they started off. Grandpa Joe was born in Olathe, Kansas.
There you
My
go.
grandfather was born in Olathe, Colorado.
That's random.
Yeah.
So in Olathe, he had some sort of store there also, Valerie was saying. Moved for whatever reason and then opened up another store in Colorado. Another fishing store.
That's the only store I ever knew that he had. And what's weird about that is my entire childhood, we never once had fish at home. Ever.
Grandpa's sick of it.
Ever.
That was kind of what you ate when you didn't have money to go buy meat because you could always bring it
go
home
get
from
it
the store.
yourself. Wait, because
We could bring it
You
home.
could bring it
Oh.
home from the store.
Grandma could. Or your grandpa could bring it home from
My-
the store.
Yeah. And my dad was probably sick of it.
Yeah.
So we, other than, I mean, not fish, but like that's why grandma or mom thinks I'm crazy. I'll eat fish, but I'll eat tuna fish, but I won't eat like bass or something. She thinks that's strange.
Because tuna is the fishiest fish of all fishes. So
And my
That's why
dad,
God invented mail.
Right. How much you got to put on it?
and Grandma
my dad's brother,
Lucy loved fish.
my dad had an older brother. His name was Bob, and he moved out here.
What?
Yeah. Never heard about him?
John and Jeff Quartz's grandfather. You guys know the
I'm looking
Quartz.
at you like.
You know Jeff and John Quartz.
Yeah, I know.
Of course.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's their grandfather.
Their grandfather, who was an insurance
I mean, I
salesman.
barely know their dad. I'm not going to remember their
Yeah.
grandma.
And he was,
Oh, you wouldn't have known his grandfather.
Right.
I never met his grandfather.
He was the exact opposite of my dad. He was the wheeler dealer talker guy. He sold insurance and was really good at it.
So he came out from Colorado. Why is everybody coming out from Colorado? I mean,
Because
the
train goes
the
through Colorado.
Yeah, I know.
Because
So it
things
sounds
were-
like it
well-
ends up here. It stops here.
Well, your dad got a job.
Well, yeah, my dad came from Annapolis right after he got out of the Navy to work with one of the aircraft companies.
Okay. So he never went to Colorado. Besides
He grew up in
growing up
Colorado.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
But he went
Colorado to the Navy.
And when he was in the
California.
Navy, because he had a degree in mechanical engineering, when he was in the service, he was responsible for refurbishing warships, diesel engines. That's what he did.
And he was in the Navy. This overlaps World War I also.
Two.
I mean, two.
Yeah, so I'm the first of the 46, the baby boomers.
And he stayed here. He didn't deploy overseas. Jack.
No, he never left the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
He'd already gone to college, so he went in as an officer, and he worked at the Navy. Well, at Annapolis is where you met your mom.
Yeah.
He was doing some training there, and then he went to the Brooklyn Naval Yard and worked there the whole time. But then when he got out, he got a job with the
I think it was Northrop think.
all of the aero.
in Hawthorne. It wasn't very
Space
far. And then he
companies
got a
were out
house.
here.
He bought a house in Gardena, which my mom never saw until she moved into it. Which today she died. She was pissed about. Talking about holding a grudge.
Can you imagine Grandpa Bob buying a house without Grandma Jean seeing it?
Yeah,
Okay,
I can
okay,
imagine
yeah.
her mind went without
No.
him seeing it.
Oh, I can too. She could. Well, she did.
So anyway, my Uncle Bob had 2 kids. The daughter was Jeff and John's mom, Joanne, and the boy, I forget.
Bobby.
Yeah, Bobby. He was kind of a wild one. Did all kinds of funny things.
He was the black sheep.
Well, he was a black sheep. He was just kind of always in trouble, always not very stable, always kind of pushing the envelope. I remember when I was little, he was how much older than me was he? Like 3 or 4 years.
Oh no, probably about 8 or 10.
Well, I remember when we were visiting him for Christmas one time. So I'm like, I don't know, 8 years old. He was 18. And big fun was to go take Christmas tree lights off houses and throw them out in the street and break them and stuff. And I couldn't even imagine doing that. But anyway. So he was married and divorced a bunch of times, and nobody really talked about him too much. And Joanne was, she was real nice, and she married a guy that Bob, who had a die cast shop, metal die casting shop. He was real mechanical, real hands-on. Him and my dad hit it off instantly. Both mechanical. My dad from a engineering point, him from running a shop and having guys working for him, and kind of a blue collar thing. And,
Did your dad only work for defense contractors, basically?
no, it wasn't defense at all at that point. No.
It was aerospace.
Aerospace, and then he worked for.
Well,
Yeah, I'm not confused.
but I mean, we
Yeah,
weren't
well,
fighting any
aerospace-
wars.
Did he have anything besides military contracts? I should say?
Yeah. When he was with Garrett Air Research, they made turbochargers before.
Okay.
I mean, half the cars produced now have turbochargers.
Yeah.
But back in the day, it was just big trucks and things like that.
Well, he also worked for McCullough, which made tools, didn't he?
Yeah.
Tractors and.
They made all kinds of stuff, power tools. But his, he pretty much did the same thing his whole life. His same field of expertise was turbochargers. It was kind of a big deal in that narrow field. I remember one time we got a call at home when I was a kid, and it was Bill Lear, the Learjet guy, and he wanted to talk to my dad about turbochargers for his planes and stuff. Anyway, that was
Your
his.
grandpa talked his ear off? Or?
Well, no,
Grandpa
my
didn't
dad
talk
didn't talk
anybody's-
anybody's ear off.
Well, he found his niche.
They wanted to know, because that was, he knew a lot about this much.
Yeah.
They wanted him to design something for him, but
I don't know, he worked in the R&D area. There was always new stuff that he got to work on.
he was working for a company where he had a clearance or some kind of government clearance, and he couldn't work for anybody else because of that clearance.
I remember,
Wasn't they didn't want to? He just couldn't.
this is like 50 years ago, but I remember at Christmas time. So Bob Courts and Jeff and John, they're like our family thing growing up was motorcycles and ATCs and stuff. Theirs was dune buggies. And at Christmas time, when we would visit them, they had Corvair dune buggies.
Corvair, as in like the car Corvair?
The car Corvair motors. That was, at that point in time, that was the big motor as opposed to a Volkswagen. I mean, it had like twice the horsepower of a Volkswagen. And if you had one that had a turbocharger, it had 3 times the horsepower. Well, my dad was in the R&D department, so he had access to all the latest and greatest stuff. And he had like boxes of leftover stuff. And I can remember going to their house in Glendale, and the moms being ticked because the guys, not me, but Bob and my dad, and then the 2 boys, they were younger than me. But my dad and Bob were in the garage putting this fancy schmancy turbo stuff on their dune buggy because they had a couple of dune buggies. I mean, talk about Christmas time for him.
Yeah.
For Bob, it was a pretty big deal. And
Were those the ones that they were racing the Baja 1000?
Their kids, Bob,
Yeah.
Jeff and John. They actually won the Baja 1000 for their class one year. That was like 15 years ago, I guess.
15 years ago.
Oh gosh, it was probably 20
It
years
was
ago.
more than
Like
15.
30 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, they were sponsored by.
I remember when they won
I
it.
think it was
you did?
30.
Yeah.
I think it
Really?
was 30.
We
There's
were-
no. I think I was before I was in high school.
Oh, for sure. Jeff and I were little guys.
Oh, well.
Because they were in their 20s.
Anyway, it was Team Honda, so it was a big deal. They were a factory sponsored deal, and they gave them a blank check. They said the only thing you can't change is the motor. We have to be able to say it was a
Stock Honda
motor.
So does that mean no turbocharge?
No turbocharge. No, this was just the boys. My dad wasn't involved at all. There was a 5-rider thing for the 1,000 miles, and the thing that was funny about that was the only thing that was stock Honda bike was the motor. Everything else was aftermarket. But and they never had kids, did they? Either one of them. So that's kind of the deal.
How often did your dad see his brother? What's courts?
Just the major.
How are those boys the courts?
Because Joanne married Bob.
Bob
Joanne
Quartz.
was a Byrne.
She married a Quartz guy.
Dad's cousin was really Joanne. She married Bob.
Joanne was my cousin.
So who was Grandpa's brother? You say Grandpa Bob's brother?
No,
Bob Burns.
Bob.
Bob Byrne.
Yeah.
That was Joanne's father. So
My
Joanne.
dad's
Am I crazy? Are you following?
Yeah.
my dad's brother.
Your dad's brother.
It's Bob.
Is
Bob. His
Byrne.
name was also Bob.
oh, okay, that's why I'm getting confused.
Joe's brother
Joe and
is
Bob.
Bob.
Yeah, Joe and
His
Bob.
daughter is Joanne,
Yes.
who
Right.
married Bob Quartz.
Yes.
Gotcha. That's where the courts boys came. Okay.
Yeah.
Now it's all coming together.
So my side of the family, we have a pretty small,
Tree.
very small tree, and then it gets to me and Valerie. Well,
More of a
and
line.
Valerie and
It's more of a
Jonathan
line than a tree.
Valerie and Jonathan have no
Yeah,
kids.
it's just a,
Yeah, it's like a root, tap root. And then, it's just
On your
me.
mom's side, you had a lot of cousins.
Yeah, but I didn't know any of them.
So not to get off track, but I remember one time you guys were on vacation somewhere in Grandma. Gene and Bob were taking care of us, and I had a family tree project in like elementary school. Good thing, well, you might have helped. Good thing Grandma was here, because Grandma was no help. And 7 of our 8 grandparents, 7 of our 8 great grandparents came from Ireland.
Yeah.
Can you confirm? Like, does that
Well,
recollection sound right?
Of my 4 grandparents, well, they didn't come from Ireland. They were born here, but their parents came over during the potato famine. So their parents came over like in the 1850s, 1860s.
Whose parents?
My
Your
great-grandparents.
Oh,
So
your
my
great-
grandparents were born here in America.
So my great. Oh, so
Yeah.
6.
But their parents all came from Ireland, except Grandpa Bob's father was English and German. But his ancestors were here, we know, before 1812. So they've been here a long, long time.
So then, of your 4, all of your grandparents,
3
your
of my
4
4
grandparents were born here.
My 4 grandparents were born here. 3 of the 4 had parents born in Ireland.
Okay.
The Sullivan, the Ryan, and the Varley were all born in Ireland. It was just the Litzinger that was.
Oh, for some reason in
German
my head I
English.
remember 7 of 8 are
Well,
grandparents being.
And then,
Maybe they're from Ireland, not born in
well, Grandpa Joe was pretty much Irish with both of his parents. And then Grandma Lucy was Scotch-Irish. So probably both of her parents may have been born in Ireland and still been Scottish. I don't know. I don't know where they were born. Or grandparents. But it's pretty heavy on the Irish.
Yeah. Not so heavy on the German. Germans.
Just one grandparent. Well, and he was German and English, so who knows how much.
All right, where are we at? Hop in whenever you feel like clarifying something. If you're not lost, I'll have to re-listen to this.
maybe I'm not deep enough. I never even really thought about your parents' parents.
Well, there wasn't a lot to think about because I never
You
talked
never-
about them.
Do you
because I didn't-
remember
I didn't-
Grandma Byrne at all? Joe's? Grandpa Joe's?
I remember Snooky really well.
I
I remember her being like a
Clone.
ill version of Grandma
Yeah,
Lucy.
because she moved in
Like
with
a
him.
perfect clone that was sick.
She looked just like Grandma. She talked like
Just-
Grandma.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
remember Snooki.
I only remember her being like jovial. I don't remember.
Oh, yeah,
her
she was a very
being-
nice
Oh,
person.
yeah, she was fine.
I
Her
remember
husband-
here. Yeah, she's not.
Considering
she's
she
got
had
whatever-
5
was
children
it
and was
cancer?
married to an alcoholic,
Whatever it was that
she was
had.
pretty. She was pretty up.
Yeah.
But Grandma Byrne would have died when you were. Well, we didn't take you to the memorial service. You were pretty low. I think the Courts kids were only like 12 and 14, so you were probably. I don't even know if you were born. Probably 2.
Are they that much older than us? How much older than
They're
Courts
10 and
was?
12 years older than Jeff.
Grandma Byrne was, Mom debates this with me, but she wasn't much of a people person and not much of a grandkid person. Mom used to visit her
She
from
was very
work.
nice to me.
Well,
But you weren't a kid at that point, right?
no,
Oh
she's,
no, she was not. But it was kind of weird because Joanne always said, well, Grandma Byrne never invited her over with her when she had kids. It was like she didn't want her kids there.
well,
But she invited us, and you went, and we're in a high chair and toddler and
that's
active. So
probably because you worked on the
That's probably the
relationship.
personalities of you, as opposed to Joanne.
But she didn't have much.
she
I
was
don't
an
know.
old lady.
She was an
even back
old
then.
lady. She wasn't touchy-feely by any stretch. She was totally. I mean, I never saw her wear anything but a dress, a fancy dress, ever.
Well, they call them house dresses.
Well, yeah, but it was.
Fancy dress in the house.
Perfect.
But it
It's
was.
like a step down from a high jet.
But when she would come to dinner every.
Stay in the kitchen.
She would come to Sunday dinner every Sunday. Well, we would go to Grandma Lucy's one week and Grandma Jean's the other.
Right.
So every other week she would come for dinner. She was dressed in a suit, and she prided herself on the fact that that suit was 30 years old. But it had no color left.
But it wasn't.
She was dressed in a suit, like what type of
a,
suit?
So it's
a
dresses.
skirt and a blouse and a jacket. Because you didn't go out of the house without your hose on and all of that stuff. Around the house, she wore a house dress.
Her apartment
Which
was
is what
absolutely.
my grandmother wore. I mean, that's what women did, older women did in the 50s.
Sure.
Her
Yeah.
apartment was absolutely immaculate, and the furniture was.
It's covered in plastic.
No. It was really, really good quality, but it was 50 years old.
But you would have not known it.
You
was
would have not
50 years
known
old.
it. As a matter of fact, when she passed, Valerie wanted one of her velvet couches.
And
Anyway,
you-
I
still-
remember that couch.
It was in Valerie's condo.
Yeah, heinous, red, uncomfortable couch.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I remember it.
But it looked
I
brand
can
new.
feel it right now.
But it looked
There's
brand
not-
new.
Her Siamese
Being
cat probably.
Horribly
lived on.
uncomfortable. Yeah, and her Siamese cat. trapped
But
inside
that was
the
the
house.
time when people bought, if you could buy, well, you bought as good as you could buy,
Yeah,
and you kept it for your
forever.
forever. You did. You only got rid of it not
There was
because of
no
the style
idea.
change.
Yeah.
Well, unless you were like Grandma Jean and she liked to just redecorate, so she did get rid of her furniture.
Oh, my parents never
10 or 12
redecorated
years.
ever.
But good furniture you can reupholster.
Yeah.
And sometimes she did that
Right.
too. Yeah.
The entire time I was a kid, my parents never ever changed the furniture. They did reupholster it. It was good stuff.
Now that you say that, I can also feel the couch. Like
That had no
Grandpa's
cushions in
condo,
it.
The green one?
where Grandpa sat actually in the far right
I remember
Yep.
that.
couch
Yep,
with
yep.
his thing, like his back support
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That hard.
And the rest of it, yeah.
That was
Valerie-
the same
Green kind of-
couch that we had my entire life.
Yeah.
And that,
Valerie
that couch
finally-
was uncomfortable. Had like a hard material.
Like a knobby type.
Well, it was industrial.
Yeah.
I guess.
Our carpeting, when the house I lived in, was some kind of industrial carpet. It was nice, but it lasted like, well, I guess it lasted like 10 years, but we had it 20 years.
Yeah.
And that was just, they did not, they weren't into that. They weren't cheap.
Didn't matter to me. All I know is under that staircase is full of toys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could care less about the couch.
Yeah, no, that kind of stuff they just didn't care about. They spent money on stuff they cared about, but they did not care about furniture. it had to be clean and all that. But
Yeah.
the styles didn't. Same with
That,
cars.
like fresh smell of burnt cigarettes.
No,
I
yeah.
fully remember that spot. Now that you say it. So, do you have any recollection of your dad ever like taking a nap on that couch?
No.
Or do you always sit in that spot, like upright,
Yeah.
smoking a cigarette or something?
And at home he had a home at our house in Gardena. He had a chair that was his chair. It was kind of like this, but it didn't rock.
Right.
And he had a table next to it his entire life, which I actually have in the attic. It's a little side table with a drawer in it and all that.
Grandpa Bob always had his chair too.
Yeah.
Grandma used to have to get rid of it when he wasn't at home because he would have kept it forever. It didn't matter
replace it.
how dirty or how grody it got or whether you could he would have kept it.
They have
forever.
oil stains in the arms from the.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Well, she used to put some kind of protectors
yeah,
on him.
yeah. But he was into comfort. He and Grandma was into it looking nice.
And then Grandpa was right next to that. He had his whole dental
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, he was always picking his teeth, cleaning his teeth.
Yeah, but he was like another level.
Because
He had like a mirror that came in and like the little tools to.
he
like,
did that
super
because at one point when he was about probably 50, he got that gum disease, gingivitis or whatever it was.
floss.
And so because his teeth just built up plaque for some reason,
Right.
he had to go to the dentist like every 3 months and have his teeth cleaned. So he was
He's like,
meticulous.
I'm going to do this myself.
And he would, in between his dental appointments, he was religious about keeping those dental appointments.
I actually have done a bunch of research on redheads and Irish in general, and almost everything you read about redheads besides skin pigment is high pain tolerance, all these excellent qualities, right? Except for gum disease.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. But Grandpa wasn't a redhead.
It's
He-
still,
yeah.
I mean, it's a recessive gene,
Yeah.
you know, so
Yeah.
I don't know.
If he had Irish in his family,
It
there
has
were
something to do
redheads
with
somewhere.
producing glutathione
Yeah.
in the gum tissue. Or
There was redheads in his family somewhere, I'm sure,
Yeah.
if they were Irish.
Yeah.
I gotta assume those are one and the same. Irish blood and redheaded blood. They're one and the same.
Yeah.
And Scottish.
Blue eyes.
Whether or not your hair comes
Red
out
hair.
red, the genes in there.
And
so-
Yeah,
Scottish,
it's in there.
yeah.
It's a recessive gene.
Scottish and Irish.
Yeah.
A
So,
lot of
well,
redheads.
blue eyes are a recessive gene,
Yeah.
and everybody in our family has blue eyes.
Yeah.
All right, where does that bring us then in the timeline? So
Brings us up to.
we're in California.
We're in California.
Grandparents are in California. Our grandparents. It's totally throwing me off too when you're saying Grandpa Byrne, because
Oh,
to me Grandpa Byrne is
my
Grandpa
dad.
Grandpa Joe. Yeah.
We always called our grandparents Grandma Litzinger and Grandma Sullivan to different instead of their first name. That's
That would
just
make it a lot easier, especially if you got two Steves for
Yeah.
grandparents, because it gets confusing with
Yeah.
Foster.
Foster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we can't do that. It gets a little sticky on Amy's side.
Oh,
Yeah.
So there's Grandpa Albert, Grandpa John, Grandpa Steve.
Yeah. There's an extra grandpa in there.
So.
But they don't know. I mean,
They
are
don't
they
care
old enough to do the
anymore.
math? Yeah, are they old enough to do the math and go, wait a minute.
No,
I mean, they know.
This
I mean,
is just the way it is.
Ashley's
Yeah.
probably figured it out.
They know whose blood,
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. They all give them presents.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like Foster's got new cousins and old cousins with Shannon's sisters marrying
Right.
into
They're
stepkids.
like, I don't know. They all
Yeah.
show up with presents.
Yeah.
You must like me.
So
now we're here.
We're
We're
here.
born. I'm born.
So you, yeah, I guess that's where we're at.
I'm born here.
You're born in
Actually,
Gardena. Are your
no.
parents living in Gardena?
Actually, I'm born before they came out here. I'm
Remember,
born
he
in
was
the
born-
Right.
He was
Because
born.
you're
in-
born-
I'm born
New
in the
York.
Brooklyn Navy Yard.
At, I assume, a military hospital
Yeah.
on base.
Yeah.
As Grandma Lucy liked to put it, it cost him $50, and she always said, "You get what you pay for."
Seems like a lot back then.
I'm sure she.
55
I'm
is
sure
a
she.
lot
It does
back
seem
then.
like
I'm
a
sure
lot.
she was kidding.
I thought that was quite a bit.
Yeah, especially since.
That's
Yeah,
probably what
military
she
days.
meant, actually, knowing how
Not knowing
Yeah.
her.
frugal she was.
No.
No,
I
she
can't
meant
even
it as a
picture
joke.
her spending $50.
She didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
I mean, that was everything.
But he took it out of
Doctor,
Grandpa's
hospital,
paycheck.
Grandpa's.
They probably took
yeah.
it out of his paycheck, huh?
Yeah.
you're-
So I was 6 months old when we came out here.
And when he came out, is he done in the
Mhm.
military? How many years did he do?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Well, let's see. If he was born in 1920, he went to school. He probably graduated in 42 because he went right through.
I have his military discharge papers.
Was he drafted? Served his draft time?
I don't
Is that
know.
kind of what people did? They served their time.
He
they were
probably-
drafted for, and then they're out.
I don't know if he drafted or he just joined. I don't know. The World War II was different.
Everybody joined.
than Vietnam and all that stuff.
Right. There's no resistance.
But
Yeah.
he got out in 45 because the war ended.
Yeah.
And when were you born?
46.
46.
Yeah,
Well, I guess
there,
he
and
he
then-
Well,
must
wait a
have had to
minute.
serve an extra. He must
Yeah.
he must have stayed in to serve out his term
and then my
because he
mom-
joined as an officer.
He
so
moved
that was
out
a bit
here, and then
different.
my mom, and I was living with my mom in Annapolis, and she brought me out here to Gardena, California.
So you born in Brooklyn. He gets discharged. You guys move back to Annapolis.
Well,
He moved here to take the job.
Yeah.
They-
my mom
Grandma
was
was
living
back.
with her parents with me while he was finishing up his military.
Out here or up there?
There.
Oh, okay. Oh, so when you were okay.
But then he comes out here, gets a job, then
buys a house and grandma
joins him.
comes.
Yeah.
But this is all within about a 6-month
Sure.
span.
Yeah. And the house is what? 3-bedroom,
Yeah.
2
One bath.
bath.
One,
No, one bath.
one
One
So
bath.
everything one bath back then?
Yeah.
Of course,
1,200
right?
square feet?
Yeah. Less than that, I think.
1,100 maybe.
I actually had the bill of sale for that house too.
900 square feet, 1 bathroom.
Well, do you have any idea what they paid for it?
Yeah, I think it was 11,000. I don't know. I can't remember.
11,000.
It's no more than 11, and it could,
This is
could
the
have been
point
9.
in the video, grandkids, where you learn don't sell dirt ever. Okay.
Because we probably estimate that house. I've never seen it.
At
but-
1.9 million
No,
today.
no.
It's probably
no,
700
no.
or 800,000 house.
No, it's not.
It's got to be
No.
700.
It sold for like 6. You can Zillow it. It sold for like 600,000. I looked it up
Not too long ago.
a few months
But
ago.
I mean, we're
Okay.
talking a little house.
Yeah.
But they
I mean,
added
if you
they
could get
added
a king
another
bed in
bath. They
that-
added another bathroom. Somebody along the line added
Only
another
60
bathroom.
times.
Yeah, 60 times. Don't sell. Don't sell unless you're buying more.
And theoretically, you could have kept
You're
the
gonna
same
steal
tax
that.
base
I'm
and you
gonna
passed that
Prop
from
drop
trust
chain.
It's splashing all the way out. Be
all the
careful.
way through. Right?
If you buy property, hold it for 70 years,
Well,
it'll be worth 60 full.
It's called buy and hold.
they bought it in 46 and sold it. Actually, when did they sell it?
Oh, you
It
were
was a few. They
22.
Oh, so you were born and essentially born and raised in that
The only
same
house he ever lived in.
I've only lived in 2 houses in my life.
There and here?
Mhm.
But he had apartments in
No,
between.
yeah.
Houses. We
Oh,
rented.
gotcha.
We rented a couple of places when we
We're
got
gonna
married.
get to that. That's all right. So we are at Gardena now. Are you in Gardena now?
I moved in when I was 13.
141st Street.
He lived on 133rd.
What block? How far east and west? Or do the numbers
Straight
run
line.
north south?
Straight line. We both lived a block off of
9
Vermont.
blocks away.
I walked a block down to Vermont and walked past his house to get to my best friend's house on 132nd.
How do you only block? Oh, you took Vermont to 141st.
Yeah.
We were both a block off of
Do
Vermont.
the numbers run north south?
Yeah.
They start at First Street in LA and they run all the way through Torrance. So
South.
we were south.
Downtown is one.
You're keeping it
Yeah.
warm.
Well, and then it's second south, third south, or it's
Yeah.
second north, depending on where you are.
Restriction.
We were south of downtown LA.
So you guys 133rd south.
He was at 133rd in Vermont, and I was at 141st in Vermont.
Gotcha. So literally straight down.
We'll say isn't USC is right around 100. Going south, right?
Oh, no, it's more like 35th or 40th Street. Well, I lived at the 100th block of Century, my first house. We were at 98th Street,
Okay.
98th South. And we moved 51 blocks more so.
Here's one.
That's why I moved out of the South Coast Metro to the west side.
That's why I don't even know the block numbers. I always get them. I forget them.
But see,
Harbor is like 2600 or something.
Yeah.
but back then
Oh, you
everything was,
Yeah.
19th Street.
you had Main Street, and then you had Olive, and then you had Grand, and then you had,
Yeah.
and Vermont ran from
Like
downtown
forever to the
all
beach.
the way to San Pedro.
Yeah.
And you had Vermont, and you had Normandy. So if you said to somebody, well, I lived at 98th Street and Van Ness, everybody knew, oh,
Yeah.
well, you were right off the corner of Century and Van Ness,
Yeah.
because Century was 100th block.
Yeah.
Everybody knew that Manchester was 120th.
Century was 100th block. How convenient.
Go figure. Huh?
Yeah. I mean, everybody, so, you know, it was so easy to find everything. And then, you know, then you,
Got confusing.
well, then people started building housing tracts like this that don't make any sense. You know, nobody, you can't, streets don't go through.
Yeah.
And they don't run north and south. Everything was on a grid. And considering that there was no civic planning back then, it just...
Irvine. Planned communities.
I mean, you didn't really need a Thomas guide. You just said, you know, I live at the 98th block of Century, and they could find you.
I say, you guys want to stop it here for attention span?
Yeah. You can do it again someday.
Yeah, we'll do it again sometime.
I might have more to contribute from
From
the
now
time I
on.
met Mom forward.
That'll give me a chance to pray. Yeah.